Hello and welcome to Sound Strategic, the podcast of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am Meia Nouwens. Today we'll examine the recent developments in the Asia-Pacific, looking in particular at the geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea and Australia's strategic policy towards China and the region. Joining me are two of my colleagues from the IISS's Asia office in Singapore, Dr. Lynn Kuok and Dr. Euan Graham, who are both IISS Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellows for Asia-Pacific Security. And both bring a wealth of knowledge with them, so looking forward to this discussion today. Welcome, Lynn and Euan.
Thanks so much, Meia. Really glad to be speaking to you today.
Likewise, Meia. Good to be with you.
Lynn, let me start with you. Despite the COVID pandemic, the South China Sea dispute has not seemed to calm down. We've seen a number of developments in the past couple of months leading to increased tensions in the region. Can you take us through what, from your perspective, have been the most important developments and whether they're different from activities that we've seen over the past few years?
Yeah, sure. I think we've seen an intensification of activities in the South China Sea. Both the United States as well as China have sent warships and fighter jets to the Taiwan Strait. We've also seen increased incursions by China into the exclusive economic zones of Indonesia, Vietnam, and now even Malaysia. Its vessel has hit and sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat, and that took place sometime in April. And we've seen China continue with a very large presence around a feature occupied by the Philippines in the Spratlys T2 island. I think a lot of this may be seen as more of the same, but what has been rather surprising, however, has been two things. One has been China's attempts to now encroach on Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. In the past, we saw a near constant but generally rather low-level presence of Chinese vessels around a feature administered by Malaysia called Luconia Shoals. In general, though, Malaysia got a free pass from China for quite some time. So it's quite surprising then that, China has sought to survey the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia. This might be linked to an extended continental shelf claim that Malaysia made late last year. But that was something that was in the making for the last 10 years or so, at least. And the other thing as well is that we've seen China also progressively encroach into Vietnam's EEZ more and more. So in the first year after the South China Sea Tribunal ruling in 2016 July, China generally laid quite low, although it said that the ruling was completely out of hand and it would not be following it. I think China generally stayed low and sought to continue low-level presence, but not shine a light on its not to do too much in the South China Sea. About a year after, it started threatening Vietnam with military action should Vietnam continue with survey activities in Vietnam's own exclusive economic zone, and that was repeated again those threats were repeated again in 2018. By 2019, China had actually actively surveyed Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. So we see a gradual escalation of its activities in the exclusive economic zone of other littoral states in the South China Sea.
That's really interesting. And Euan, it's not just China, of course, but the US and others have also been ever present in the region. So we've seen an uptick recently in the number of countries participating in, for example, sailing through the South China Sea or conducting exercises there. Australia's HMAS Parramatta joined 3 U.S. warships in April this year. So what is this a reflection of?
Well, let's not forget that this is taking place in the context of a global pandemic, which has also stretched the military capabilities of the United States and other countries, which are understandably preoccupied and distracted in some cases. Their own militaries have been affected. So I think there's a general sense that while it may look like business as usual is rather provocative given the circumstances. I think on the United States part, they have been generally motivated by a concern to be present and to make sure that China is not emboldened to go beyond business as usual and do anything rash at a period when the United States, its allies and partners have their guard down. I think that can be the part of the explanation for a fairly assertive approach in April and May on the part of the United States to get an amphibious-ready group, several ships, including a large ship which operates the F-35 jet fighter, as a way of demonstrating to the Southeast Asians that the United States was basically still around, and that would be a factor that China would have to take into account in its actions with all comers. The interesting thing is that the reaction of the Malaysians themselves was rather ambivalent to that. That they, as Lynn has said, I think they have their own bilateral preference and a sense that they can work things out with China, even when they're on the receiving end of bullying tactics from China. You mentioned Australia. That was not a hugely significant military role, but I think nonetheless important that Australia was in the South China Sea, continues its presence there, and is also a way of demonstrating that it hasn't wholly dropped its guard and was still continuing to operate with the US Navy.
So maybe looking at other countries in Southeast Asia and how they're responding to this intensification of activity in the South China Sea. Vietnam currently holds the ASEAN chairmanship until the end of this year, and the first of this year's two summits was postponed and will be held at the end of this month in June. So what can we expect from this summit with regards to the South China Sea dispute? Can we see, for example, whether progress will be made of on the code of conduct with China, which, according to Li Keqiang, should have been, will be, or will hopefully be concluded by 2021? Can either of you give us an update on this?
I could chip in first. I think in general, the code of conduct has been a bit of a farce, but countries continue with it because China looks like it's offering a fig leaf, and so that helps China. And from the perspective of ASEAN, it looks like it's, playing a central role in driving the dispute towards, if not resolution, then at least managing the dispute. So I expect that process to continue, even though there might be accusations of Chinese activities in the South China Sea. So we will trudge along that path. But I think ultimately there are several issues which plague the conclusion of a meaningful code of conduct. I think the first one would be the scope of application of the code of conduct. Should it apply to the entire South China Sea or only to the areas under dispute? For instance, would Vietnam accept to a code of conduct applying within their exclusive economic zone? The second issue that's quite sticky is whether or not undertakings should include one of restraint, so stop building or stop militarizing features in the South China Sea, or whether that should be something less than that, such as an obligation to promote trust and confidence building. Of course, from China's perspective, it should be the latter. Trust me, I'm China, I don't have any bad intentions. The third issue I would suggest would be how disputes should be resolved under the code of conduct. And I think for it to be meaningful, there needs to be reference within the code of conduct to compulsory dispute resolution. And finally, there's still an issue remaining about, what the legal status of the code of conduct should be. Should this be a binding code of conduct or merely a political document, a political statement, in which case it will be little different from the declaration of the code of conduct concluded decades ago, and which has done very little to help manage the dispute.
I mean, with all of that in mind, it doesn't sound very promising, and considering the current context of great power rivalry between the U.S. and China, again, what do you think we can expect from the summit this year?
I think the broader issue that ASEAN faces is that Asian multilateralism has really suffered in the pandemic. It's not the only casualty, but its inactivity is conspicuous. And I think many countries have noted that. There's been an upsurge in bilateralism as a way of working around that. And that's not only due to the incapacity of the pandemic. I think there's a broader issue that the Code of Conduct crystallizes, namely that China is able to maneuver the ASEAN countries in a way that is inimical to their interests in the South China Sea. I think what China really wants is the Code of Conduct to be a template, a kind of moving template that also instructs and educates Southeast Asian countries into understanding that China is not going away and that it's China's way of dealing at the South China Sea on their terms, excluding other foreign interventions, be they military or diplomatic. I think that's the way in which China has learned that the Code of Conduct works in its favour. And unfortunately, I think ASEAN has lost some impetus. I see that from tracking it from an Australian perspective, where I find that interesting because Australia pays a great deal of attention to ASEAN as being at the core of its foreign policy, and that's rather dropped out in the last month. We've seen instead that Australia has been instead focusing on the G20, the UN, now prospectively an enlarged G7, and where it is playing in Asia. Asia, of course, is still vital, but it tends to be the bilaterals that are coming through. And that is only going to work, I think, in China's favour. Vietnam, of course, is the strongest of all the Southeast Asian countries because it has most at stake. And I think, paradoxically, although it has a land border with China, it knows how to deal with China through a position of strength better, I think, than any other ASEAN country.
That's really interesting. Lynn, would you agree that there is still disunity within ASEAN when it comes to responding to the challenges posed by China in the South China Sea? Or would you say that there's been a change in mood within ASEAN when it comes to the dispute and how to respond to China?
I think there's certainly disunity within ASEAN in terms of how to deal with China and the South China Sea. The obvious outliers are Cambodia and Laos, who are certainly in China's camp in this respect. But even within the claimant states, we have Brunei in 2016 signing a declaration together with Cambodia, Laos, and China that the South China Sea dispute is really for parties, claimants to the South China Sea to deal with and not outsiders, ignoring the fact that, of course, the South China Sea is an international waters, and other countries have an interest in the South China Sea, as well as the fact that they have an interest in a peaceful resolution of the dispute and adherence to the rule of law. So that's also a clear division. But even within other claimant states who have been a little bit more forward-leaning, like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. Vietnam, as Euan mentioned, is the most forward-leaning. Malaysia is kind of confused about what the position should be. It doesn't want to offend China, and in that respect has been quite rough on the United States. But I'm rather worried that, I think Malaysia has to be careful what it wishes for. If it doesn't want the United States around, the United States, particularly under this administration, might decide, okay, then no more presence operations when you're in trouble. And then you have Indonesia, that has also sought to, be more forward-leaning in terms of protecting its fishing resources in the face of Chinese incursions earlier at the end of last year and this year. But Indonesia, it's approaching the dispute very much as a bilateral issue between itself and China, and it is very reluctant to take up a leadership role in terms of forging a stronger ASEAN response. And I think the most obvious example of how ASEAN has failed to come together is a very simple one, the negotiations in the Code of Conduct. What would make the most sense is for ASEAN to come up with a draft Code of Conduct, and then have that go through reiterations with China. What they have instead had, even the so-called single draft negotiating text, what that ultimately is a very basic and skeletal text with the positions of the various countries then stipulated within that text. So that's not a single draft, that's multiple drafts. And the reason for that is that China in the past has objected to ASEAN coming up with a single negotiating text. So this has been the approach. The multiple country approach has been the approach because of fears of Chinese objections.
That's really interesting. Of course, this raises a question for me whether within this wider context of US-China competition and rivalry at the moment, whether countries in Southeast Asia, in the wider Asia-Pacific region, are going to have to choose between a stronger relationship with China or the United States. Singaporean Prime Minister Lee has published just today on the 4th of June an essay in Foreign Affairs in which he emphasizes the importance of the US-China relationship, really reiterating that stability in the region requires cooperation between the two countries and that other states shouldn't have to choose between the two. Do you think that this is a sustainable and realistic approach or an option for most countries as tensions ramp up? Maybe start with Euan?
I think the idea that it comes down to a single choice is a falsehood. It's going to be a number of choices cut across multiple issues, the South China Sea being just one. And that gives Southeast Asia some leeway that they know they have a muscle memory because Southeast Asian countries have dealt with great powers in the same way long before the Europeans showed up into prehistory. So I think Southeast Asia will find a way that means they're not shoehorned into an exclusive choice. And I think the United States is not behaving in the most conducive way diplomatically, to put it mildly. But even they would understand that I think presenting things as an exclusive choice is a no-sell in Southeast Asia. Again, I think that you have to look at it where it breaks down at the national level. We've had one interesting data point just in the last couple of days come in that the Philippines, having long said for several months that it was going to abrogate the visiting forces agreement with the United States, which means that the US can bring its forces in as a treaty ally, it has now reversed course. That seems to be a sort of typical Duterte flip-flop. Probably not one that's strategically motivated, but nonetheless, it does, I think, help this position of the United States at a time when there's been a stream of bad news from inside the country, and that in Southeast Asia, at least, that's one problem that it hopefully will not have to face come August, which is when that agreement was due to expire.
I just wanted to add something to the question of choice. I think in general, ASEAN countries have been very reluctant to choose between the United States and China, and they've said this repeatedly. So Prime Minister Lee said this in the Foreign Affairs article you mentioned, but he also said that last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, ASEAN countries do not want to choose. The United States and China both also say we are not asking you to choose. However, the behavior has clearly put ASEAN countries into a very tight spot. So how have ASEAN countries sought to navigate the rough waters between the two superpowers? It's been difficult, but I think an attempt of navigating or seeking to balance the two was tried when it issued its ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I think it was last June. And that document, while adopting Indo-Pacific terminology, also talked about the importance of infrastructure development in the region, and I think that was a clear nod to China. It also reasserted ASEAN centrality in principles such as respect for sovereignty and non-intervention. And I think this was also a reminder to the two superpowers that, they should not be rocking the ASEAN boat in terms of, asking them to make choices. I think ultimately, as great power rivalry rumbles along, I think it's going to be more and more difficult, as we see with the whole debacle around 5G. It's going to be more and more difficult for ASEAN countries to stay out of the fray and to not make choices. And I think what they need to be doing, and what I think that with varying levels of success doing, is to not take the side of either the United States or China necessarily, but to say that we will take the side of international law and the rules-based order, and we will side with the superpower that seeks to adhere this. And this might be a different superpower depending on the issue, but I think this at least takes away some of the hard edges of the competition between the United States and China, and puts ASEAN countries at least in a more palatable position.
So moving away from Southeast Asia then to a little bit further afield, Euan, Australia's relationship with China has become increasingly confrontational in the last 2 years, a year and a half. Can you give us a little bit of a background as to why this relationship is worsening at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it may sound odd to our listeners why Australia-China would be interesting. I mean, after all, to put it in its proper context, India is currently facing incursions across its Himalayan frontier with China that has a potential military flashpoint to it. So Australia dealing with barley tariffs is rather mild by comparison, but nonetheless, I think Australia is interesting as a bellwether, certainly for how liberal democracies and US allies in the region react to China. And why is that? Well, I think it's for two rather obvious reasons, but I'll spell them out. One is that Australia is more geographically exposed than certainly the Five Eyes allies because of where it sits in the middle of the Indo-Pacific. And also it is more economically exposed to China, having more than a third of its trade in goods accounted for in that relationship. So it's often compared in somewhat cliched terms to the canary in the coal mine, but you can see why, because this might be a vision of the future that other countries have to deal with. And for no coincidence that Australia has in some respects been ahead of the curve in the measures that it's taken. For example, the foreign interference legislation that it introduced, the 5G decision, these were ahead of the curve even of the United States.
And what lessons does Australia's relationship with China have for other countries, not just in the region, but further afield? I mean, what are the main takeaways here? We know that China responds differently to different countries in its bilateral relationships, depending on who those countries are and how important they are to China's economy or a global standing. So, for example, Australia's relationship with China has taken a different turn, or China rather has responded differently to in its relationship with Australia than it has with Australia's Five Eyes partner New Zealand, for example.
That's right. I think the tableau to look at this through would be the experience of the last month, where we had Australia going out on the international scene for the first time, really kind of head to head, if you like, with China on a major conflictual issue, which was the call for an inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic, which saw Australia, rather gamely, but perhaps not advisedly, exposed in the teeth of a blame game between the two superpowers, with the United States rather ambivalent in some ways about Australia's approach to the inquiry, because it had its own set of findings that Australia did not support, and yet China at the same time threatening Australia with trade retaliation and a full-blown, full-throated wolf warrior disinformation campaign and stream of invective. So it was certainly a hot seat that Canberra was in. How relevant is that to other countries? Well, I think go back to the issue that Australia is interesting as a liberal democracy and a member of the Five Eyes alliance around the United States. So in that sense, I think it's also a tempting target for China. If we assume that China, one of its core objectives is to splinter the US alliance in the Pacific, which will improve its security situation, then Australia is going to be a very obvious target. Not a target necessarily for direct military coercion, as we've seen in the South China Sea or on the India-China border, but using that economic cudgel of a 35% plus reliance as a trade partner. And I think that's a very interesting set of policy dilemmas for Canberra, because it's not just the kind of traditional approach to balancing that will be necessary. It's a much more comprehensive, more complex set of considerations in which Canberra is also finding its way without the support or reliance of its traditional ally, at least not to anywhere the degree that it's comfortable doing in previous cases. So I think there's also a kind of middle power paragon value to what Australia is doing. It may not have made perfect choices. I think it certainly took a very high level of risk in going out ahead of the pack in a way that probably wasn't necessary. It should have done some preliminary consultations before announcing its intentions. But nonetheless, it did get a diplomatic win of sorts with the passage of a draft motion through the World Health Assembly. And I think that's healthy for Australia, but also for other countries to look at it and say, well, okay, the lights didn't go out. Bali may have suffered, but the economic relationship with China and others continues. And it's that stitching together of middle powers that's going to be key. We've also seen that with subsequent measures announced with the idea of economic resilience and removing vulnerability in the supply chain, particularly where there's an exposure to China. Just today, Prime Minister Morrison has concluded a virtual bilateral summit with his counterpart Mahendra Modi in India. We'll see what comes out of that. If there's movement towards cooperating on these geoeconomic issues, then I think that will be helpful for the traction for others that look and are rather afraid of going over the parapet themselves.
I mean, European countries are clearly watching Australia's foreign policy towards China and how it responds to the challenges that China poses in the areas of trade, with economic coercion in mind, and others. But NATO, of course, is also deciding what its China policy should be. Secretary General Stoltenberg last year said that this is a response to China coming to Europe and not about NATO going to the Asia Pacific. And I wanted to ask you both what countries in the region would think about a potential role for NATO with regards to China and upholding the rules-based international order in the Asia Pacific. Would a NATO presence, if that were ever envisioned in the Asia Pacific, be welcomed, or would it further complicate matters? I suppose my question gets to the heart of how much cooperation coordination is useful and helpful before it becomes complicated and unhelpful.
Let me take a stab at that, Meia. Last year, I gave testimony before the UK Defence Committee inquiry into the security situation in the Far East. And to do my research into the issue, I spoke to various people in the region, and I asked them what they thought of a greater UK military presence in the region. And although in principle, I think they were quite welcoming of middle powers like the UK seeking to balance the power in the region, I think there was in general a great deal of skepticism about, in this case, it was the relevance of the UK and what it could actually do in the midst of Brexit and after Brexit, and whether actually at the end of the day a sort of half-hearted presence that came and went might be more trouble than it was worth. So in that context, I think the committee was asking about whether or not, countries like Singapore, Brunei would welcome a UK military base in these countries. And I think from the perspective of ASEAN countries, it would be, we would anger China by doing that, while not having the reassurance of strategically weighty country that stayed their ground. And so I think from that perspective, they were quite reluctant to rock the boat too much. I suspect that they would look towards greater NATO participation in the region or greater NATO presence in the region with the same sort of wariness. Is it going to be a sustained presence that is significant and that would help to maintain the balance of power in the region, even if it angers China a little bit at the outset? Or is it just going to anger China with no real effect in terms and possibly make things worse because it comes and goes?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between the balance of power and the balance of resolve or numerous other balances that might be brought into play here. Europe is not going to materially affect the balance of power in East Asia. China is simply too strong for France or the UK or the EU or whoever to really make a difference. So when aircraft carriers show up, they make a point, and the states that operate them like to use them perhaps in a totemistic sort of way, but they don't really count in the balance of power. They count more in terms of global balancing, in which I think it's far more important that the UK, France, EU, whoever, play their role in maintaining open free trade arrangements, that they speak up for democracies, that they make statements on human rights, and if necessary that they take self-protection measures to protect their supply chains. This is where it's really going to count in the early part of the 21st century rather than the balance of power. So I think NATO is really the hammer in the toolbox that's a little out of place. It's going to be maybe important to have a dialogue between NATO and Europe, but as NATO has itself said, the old model of Europe bringing a kind of voluntary contribution to East Asia is now rather passé, because China is in Europe's midst and knocking on its door, and in partnership with Russia posing a potential strategic threat that Europeans will have to directly take into account. And of course there's that. If Europe does decide to play a hard power role, then the red phone might be ringing very quickly from Beijing to Moscow, asking for a reciprocal favour to take Europeans' attentions away. I think there has to be some realism about what level of influence Europe can bring to bear, especially given how hard it's been knocked in the current pandemic. But it's not all doom and gloom. I do think that European member states are going to continue to have a presence in this part of the world, which is useful. But it's not really one that comes under a NATO or even an EU banner. The UK, of course, is now out of the EU, but has signalled that it's going to continue a forward presence, and I think that's likely to happen. It may be small patrol boats, but nonetheless, it's present in a way that I think there will be some receptivity to that on the part of individual Southeast Asian countries, and certainly from the bigger Asian powers, Japan, and including Australia as an Indo-Pacific state too.
I completely agree with Euan. It's critical that countries like the UK, France, Germany, and even the Netherlands maintain a sort of presence in the region, And as Ian pointed out, it's more than just the military balance of power. It's also about sending a signal that rules matter, that the rules-based order matters, and that and that countries were willing to take certain actions to support that the rules-based order. So even though any individual country might not be able to make a significant difference in terms of the military balance of power in the region, I think collectively they send a strong message that we all want good behavior and we all benefit from good behavior. And I think the other important thing about a European presence in the region as well is it takes the edge off a direct US-China competition. China has been able to has repeatedly stated that this is about the United States wanting to remain hegemon in the region. It's about the United States wanting to contain China, but with the involvement of other middle powers, including European powers, we see a different message emerge. We see a message that rules matter, and we're going to do all we can to maintain the rules that have benefited all of us, big or small.
Yeah, I just think there has to be some humility on the Europeans' part about how things have changed very dramatically in the last few months. There can't be any more lectures about Europe's status as a model of capacity building and crisis prevention and crisis response when it was caught clearly flat-footed and divided in the pandemic. I wouldn't want to be the next European official who has to go in front of a nation audience to make those points. So I think that narrative certainly has to adjust. But as Lynn says, I think it remains the case that partly because the United States is seen as more capricious and less reliant than it has been in the past, there is going to be some demand on the Asian states for a European role. And I think it's important that those Asian states do make that point, because the Europeans, frankly, they have their work cut out just to simply maintain defence budgets as they are, let alone sending ships to the other side of the world. So I think that if you want it to happen, it has to be an iterative two-way process, and that the demand signal has to be unambiguous and clear from Asian countries, and that the assumption that the old contribution is going to sort of show up in the form of a rainbow fleet of Norwegian and Danish and Netherlands and whoever else ships just doesn't really hold anymore. I think one point I just would like to make also, the United States, although it is going through a phase, to put it mildly, that throws a lot of doubt in the minds of its allies and partners, it has also played a role in asking European countries to be more interested. I think in a post-COVID environment, that is going to be an easier sell to the Europeans for the obvious reason that China has simply created a lot of unnecessary antipathy towards itself in the way that it's conducted its diplomacy.
I'm really happy that you raised that last point, because it leads perfectly into my next question, which is really for you both to kind of hone in on what the U.S. role in the Asia Pacific is at the moment, and what perceptions of U.S. leadership are. Have these changed? Is the U.S. a less dependable ally for Southeast Asian and Asia Pacific countries?
I think there's no doubt that COVID-19 and the U.S. response to it has further dented the confidence of ASEAN and Asian countries in the ability of the United States to demonstrate any degree of leadership, at least under this administration. I think the US response to COVID-19 saw it shirk regional and global leadership, and in some cases actually shirk responsibility. Its actions showed total disregard for allies and partners. It's the failure of the G7 to issue a statement was simply because of the United States, the President of the United States, seeking to bolster his nationalistic support. And it's just been an embarrassment and disappointment, frankly. So I think ASEAN countries would be hard-pressed to have any degree of confidence in the United States at this point in time. However, I think many must be looking towards the November elections and hoping for reprieve from the current state. I think it's true that that COVID reveals that the United States has deep structural issues that are not going to go away. But I think the failure of leadership, they are hoping, and I certainly think this is partly the case, has been very much linked to the disastrous handling of the situation by the current president of the United States. So I think there is a great degree of wariness of China that is retained in the region, but the region still wants to continue to work with China, given the uncertainty about U.S. Commitment to the region and its ability to sustain leadership moving forward. But I think the region would like to have choices, and I think they won't be making any definitive decisions until after the November elections.
Euan, do you agree, or has the region lost respect for the United States to some extent?
I think the United States has always been in this rather invidious position that there's no sweet spot for it in the region. It's either too hot or too cold. Fears of abandonment, fears of entrapment seem to constantly dominate even the thoughts of its closest allies. But at the moment, they seem to be fearing both entrapment and abandonment together, which is the sign, I think, very clearly of a mismanaged alliance relationship on the part of the United States. But stepping up from that, just at a very basic level, one has to be extremely worried. Just looking at events out of the United States in the past week, that we see almost an implosion going on of the United States in its coherence as a country, let alone as an international actor. And there obviously have to be a whole series of strategic flow-on questions arising from that. Whether the United States now goes through a period of intense introspection, maybe even of continuing decline, which has the same virtual effect as a period of isolationism. Whether or not the United States wants to be engaged, many people are simply going to be focused on restoring basic stability and coherence at home. So I think, although I have some sympathy that the United States is always in that too hot or too cold position in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia, where I think its allies are often not its best friends. One thinks of the recent experience with the Philippines, where it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, one story, and then the rest of the week a thoroughly different narrative, depending on which side of the bed President Duterte has got out of. But I think that if we reduce it back to a balance of power calculation, China cannot be balanced absent the United States. I'm firmly convinced of that. So I think that will cast its influence on thinking, certainly within the region, in a helpful way. This finally asks the question of allies and partners who forever are talking about having to do more independently and of their own volition. Well, now it's real. The question is being asked in this void of leadership by the United States. we do see some positive signs emerging, I think, of new partnerships beginning to happen on a global basis, not just in the region. That's what I've noticed in the way that Australia's diplomatic contours have flipped away from the kind of traditional focus on ASEAN. But of course, it is going to come down to Asia in the end for countries in this region. That's the bottom line, and they will have to stitch together as broad and creative networks as they can until such point as the United States comes back into play as a more dependable actor. It may not. That is also another possibility that we face. If there is a second Trump term, then I think we are looking at a very dark scenario indeed.
Well, on that note, I want to acknowledge that today is the 4th of June and the anniversary of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. And a yearly vigil to commemorate the occasion in Hong Kong has been banned this year due to reasons related to the COVID pandemic. But it seems that people will still plan to commemorate the occasion by lighting candles across the city. There are questions, of course, as to whether Hong Kong will be able to do so and commemorate this occasion again in the future, keeping in mind that at the two sessions NPC this year in China, the national security law was passed, raising questions over the future of Hong Kong's relative autonomy under the one country, two systems arrangement. Now, the U.S. has spoken strongly against these developments, but as you noted, Euan, other countries have also come together to speak out against this. Notably, there was a joint statement on the situation in Hong Kong by Australia, Canada, the UK, and the United States. I wanted to ask, how do other countries in the region view these developments? Perhaps, Lynn, from a Southeast Asian perspective.
I think Southeast Asia in general is a lot less seized by the issue of Hong Kong and the national security law that the PRC is seeking to pass in Hong Kong. I think the reason for that is that from the perspective of many countries in the region who privilege security and stability, the events of Hong Kong last year were very damaging to Hong Kong's status as a financial center and hurt businesses, hurt the economy, and ultimately hurt people. So that's kind of the mindset that many, of course not everyone, but many people in the region that I've spoken to view the events last summer. I think the view, and then of course there's the view that the protests don't really help, or the riots didn't really help. Protests, in my view, riots in some others' views, didn't really help the situation in Hong Kong because if it is about economic inequality, which many of the people in the region thought it was, then it has not resolved the situation. But I think the troubles that Hong Kong are now facing are far deeper than economic issues, but more to do with fundamental issues of political rights and identity. I don't think that many of the young people identify with the PRC more broadly, and I think that's the ultimate difficulty. In terms of what has been, in terms of countries like the UK, the statement by the 7 former foreign ministers saying that, the UK should lead an international response to responding to the situation in Hong Kong. I think there will be some condemnation of what China is doing, but I don't know that that's going to change matters very much. And if we look at the situation in the UK, it looks like quite a mess from outside. It's got Brexit coming. It's got negotiations over Brexit coming up. It's got the COVID situation still unresolved. It's adrift from the EU. It's, on the choppy waters of transatlantic ties. Can it really afford to estrange itself from China moving forwards? I don't know. Maybe it will find some backbone and stand on the matter of principle, but I don't know that it's going to be sustainable. And then in terms of the U.S. the US potentially imposing sanctions and revoking trade principles. I'm also not clear how that will help Hong Kong. It might hurt China marginally, but certainly less than it would have in the past when Hong Kong formed a lot a far higher percentage of the PRC's GDP. Ultimately, such trade sanctions might even hurt the United States because it currently enjoys a trade surplus with Hong Kong, ironically. So it's really a difficult situation, and I'm not sure that there's any clear way out of it.
Yeah, I'd agree that very few countries in Asia would be prepared to take a public stand on Hong Kong. We did see a refreshingly forward-leaning statement out of Japan in recent days, but I wouldn't expect it would go any further than that. So I think it is a fact of life that on Hong Kong it's going to be left to the UK with its particular responsibility in the matter, but also to the so-called like-minded, the Canada, Australia, and the United States to coordinate their positions. And I'm glad that they have. I think that's one lesson for Australia from the COVID inquiry, is having gone out all alone and found out that there were some rather chill international winds in that environment. It's better to find friends before you do so again, and at least there are friends to be able to do that with. I think as a liberal democracy, you have to stand out in favour of human rights and democracy, regardless of whether China will change its position or not. I don't think that's just whistling in the wind. It's a vital expression of who you are and your confidence in your own system and your willingness not to be silenced in the face of clear coercion from China. But I think it would also be a mistake to look at Hong Kong in isolation as somehow something that's sui generis, or just a city-state that's in a state of anarchy or meltdown. There's much more at play at this. Look at what China's doing elsewhere. It's taking on an extraordinary amount of confrontation with India on one hand, with Taiwan, and of course Taiwan is intimately linked to the Hong Kong situation, because even the Kuomintang has now admitted that one country, two systems is untenable as a platform for it to hold electorally within Taiwan. And that, of course, is going to sharpen the choice for China, because if there's no peaceful route to reunification through the people of Taiwan will choose as a result of how Beijing has treated Hong Kong, then that's a clear, very important strategic connection right there. But I think it's Hong Kong as a microcosm of how China's behavior is going to play out in contradiction, in violation of its own international treaty level agreements. I think that's the most disturbing exemplar effect of Hong Kong. Our ability to actually do anything about it is going to be very limited, with one exception, which will be to open up places for potential refugees in future. And I think the June the 4th date hangs heavy in the air there, and I think it's only right that Britain is prepared to do that. And I think, although I'm very critical of the UK policies in many other respects, I do think they have got their act together a little bit on China in the last month, and Hong Kong is one element of that. And I think that the agreement in principle to extend a 1-year residency for those Hong Kong British overseas passport holders is a good one, and one that I think should be extended in time and proportionate to what they can accept to Canada and Australia as well.
I just wanted to pick up on one point that Euan made, because I think that was critical, namely that you cannot look at Hong Kong in isolation. And that's the same with many of the other issues that we are confronting, many of the difficult issues we're confronting today, many think the issue, for example, of the South China Sea is over just rocks and reefs in the South China Sea, and it doesn't concern a faraway country. But all these issues relate to international law, to the rule of law, to how countries as they rise behave, to how countries between themselves behave, whether they compete within the constraints of a rules-based order, or it's a no holds barred competition. And I think the latter would be tremendously problematic for the world moving forward. And what we should all be working for is to see the linkages between various issues and try to ensure that principles don't fall apart and get picked apart by by great power rivalry or bad behavior.
Well, thank you so much both for being on the show and sharing your insights. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think you've both shown that there's a lot to keep an eye on, a lot of developments that will most likely be rolled out over the next few months, and that we at the IISS and particularly also at the Asia office will be covering keenly. To keep up to date with the latest trends in international security and armed conflict, please follow us on Twitter and Instagram. See you all next time.